Hello everybody, I'm Miss Jessica from 𝘏𝘏𝘭𝘦𝘴 and we are continuing our chapter book story time, Holes by Louis Sachar, and Stanley has just kind of made a decision that maybe they should go back and see what's going on at Camp Green Lake. So he and Hector have been missing for quite a while. So let's see what happens. Chapter 43. We weren't always homeless, 𝘏𝘏 said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you... Stanley started to ask, but couldn't find the right words. Moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me, that one you sang. It was different though. 𝘏𝘏 spoke slowly as if searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later, I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, 𝘏𝘏 had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now as he lay on his back trying to save his strength for the long days ahead, he wondered what had happened to 𝘏𝘏's parents. But he didn't ask. 𝘏𝘏 didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried they might be evicted from their apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. And again, he wondered if they'd been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. I'm gonna adjust real quick. There we go. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he'd had the night before. The inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. 𝘏𝘏 held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. 𝘏𝘏 turned and looked up toward the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, the onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? 𝘏𝘏 asked from above. Stanley groaned and pulled a thorn out of his palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. 𝘏𝘏 climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them, like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, 𝘏𝘏 said. They'd lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon, they stood on the edge of a cliff looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it will lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want to drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, but more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero was now carrying the sack, set it down, and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. You know, I'm not thirsty, said Stanley, as he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking so that you will. I'm just drinking so that you will, said Zero. They clinked the jars together and each, watching the other, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a 1/4 mile away and just a little bit off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, said Zero. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, said Zero. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was really little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a doorway. Now don't leave here until I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffe. Stanley guessed that Jaffe was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day, she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape? Asked Zero. Yeah, I've played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know the tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb, he said. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, said Zero. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be about the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then that same mother told me, go away. And she told the kids to stay away from me. So I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast, I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever find him? It? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that's how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. "Hold on," said Zero, stopping abruptly. "We're going the wrong way." "No, this is right," said Stanley. "You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right," said Zero. "That means we should have turned right when we left the boat." "You sure?" Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. There's his diagram. Stanley still wasn't sure. "We need to go this way," Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. "Listen," Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Stir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. "Let's wait here until they go in," said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it. Then he climbed down into the hole. Zero climbed in the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. Soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept toward camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound. The tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Chapter 44. Stanley tried to sleep, not knowing when he'd get the chance again. He heard the showers and later the sounds of dinner. He heard the creaking of the rec room door. His fingers drummed against the side of the hole. He heard his own heartbeat. He took a drink from the canteen. He had given Zero the water jars. They each had a good supply of onions. He wasn't sure how long he remained in the hole, maybe 5 hours? He was surprised when he heard Zero whispering for him to wake up. He didn't think he'd fallen asleep. If he had, he must have thought it must have been just for the last 5 minutes, although when he opened his eyes, he was surprised at how dark it was. There was only one light on at the camp office. The sky was cloudy, so there was very little starlight. Stanley could see a sliver of moon, which appeared and disappeared among the clouds. He carefully led Zero to the hole, which was hard to find in the darkness. He stumbled over a small pile of dirt. "I think this is it," he whispered. "You think?" Zero asked. "It's it," said Stanley, sounding more certain than he really was. He climbed down. Zero handed him the shovel. Stanley stuck the shovel into the dirt at the bottom of the hole and stepped on the back of the blade. He felt it sink beneath his weight. He scooped out some dirt and tossed it off to the side. Then he brought the shovel back down. Zero watched for a while. "I'm going to try to refill the water jars," he said. Stanley took a deep breath and exhaled. "Be careful," he said, then continued digging. It was so dark. He couldn't even see the end of his shovel. For all he knew, he could be digging up gold and diamonds instead of dirt. He brought each shovelful close to his face to try to see if anything was there before dumping it out of the hole. As he made the hole deeper, it became harder to lift the dirt up and out. It was 5 feet deep before he had even started. He decided to use his efforts to make it wider instead. This made more sense, he told himself. If Kate Barlow had buried a treasure chest, she probably wouldn't have been able to dig much deeper. So why should he? Of course, Kate Barlow probably had a whole gang of thieves helping her. You want some breakfast? Stanley jumped at the sound of Zero's voice. He hadn't even heard him approach. Zero handed him down a box of cereal. Stanley carefully poured some cereal into his mouth. He didn't want to put his dirty hands inside the box. He nearly gagged on the ultra-sweet taste. They were sugar-frosted flakes, and after eating nothing but onions for more than a week, he had trouble adjusting to the flavor. He washed them down with a swig of water. Zero took over the digging. Stanley sifted his fingers through the fresh piles of dirt in case he had missed anything. He wished he had a flashlight. A diamond, no bigger than a pebble, would be worth thousands of dollars. Yet, there was no way he'd see it. They finished the water that Zero had gotten from the spigot by the showers. Stanley said he'd go fill the jars again, but Zero insisted that he do it instead. No offense, but you make too much noise when you walk. You're too big. Stanley returned to the hole. As the hole grew wider, parts of the surface kept caving in. They were running out of room. To make it much wider, they would first have to move some of the surrounding dirt piles out of the way. He wondered how much time they had before the camp woke up. How's it going? Zero asked when he returned with the water. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. He brought the shovel down on the side of the hole, shaving off a slice of the dirt wall. As he did so, he felt the shovel bounce off something hard. What was that? Zero asked. Stanley didn't know. He moved a shovel up and down the side of the hole. As the dirt chipped and flaked away, the hard object became more pronounced. It was sticking out of the side of the hole about 1.5 feet from the bottom. He felt it with his hands. What is it? Zero asked. He could just feel a corner of it. Most of it was still buried. It had a cool, smooth texture of metal. I think I might have found the treasure chest, he said. His voice was filled more with astonishment than with excitement. Really? Asked Zero. I think so, Stanley said. The hole was wide enough for him to hold the shovel lengthwise and dig sideways into the wall. He knew he had to dig very carefully. He didn't want the side of the hole to collapse along with the huge pile of dirt already above it. He scraped the dirt wall until he exposed one entire side of the box-like object. He ran his fingers over it. It felt to be about 8 inches tall, almost 2 feet wide. He had no way of knowing how far into the earth it extended. He tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. He was afraid that the only way to get it out was to start back up at the surface and dig down. They didn't have time for that. I'm going to try to dig a hole underneath it, he said. Then maybe I can pull it down and slip it out. Go for it, said Zero. Stanley jammed the shovel into the bottom edge of his hole and carefully began to dig a tunnel underneath the metal object. He hoped it didn't cave in. Occasionally, he'd stop, stoop down, and try to feel the far end of the box. But even when the tunnel was as long as his arm, he still couldn't feel the other side. Once again, he tried pulling it out, but it was firmly in the ground. If he pulled too hard, he feared he'd cause a cave-in. He knew that when he was ready to pull it out, he would have to do so quickly before the ground above it collapsed. As his tunnel grew deeper and wider and more precarious, Stanley was able to feel latches on one end of the box and then a leather handle. It wasn't really a box. I think it might be some kind of metal suitcase, he told Zero. Can you pry it loose with the shovel? Asked Zero. I'm afraid the side of the hole will collapse. You might as well give it a try, said Zero. Stanley took a sip of water. Might as well, he said. He forced the tip of the shovel between the dirt and the top of the metal case and tried to wedge it free. He wished he could see what he was doing. He worked at the end of the shovel back and forth, up and down until he felt the suitcase fall free. Then he felt the dirt come piling down on top of it. But it wasn't a huge cave-in. As he knelt down in the hole, he could tell only that a small portion of the earth had collapsed. He dug with his hands until he found the leather handle. Then he pulled the suitcase up and out of the dirt. I got it, he exclaimed. It was heavy. He handed it to Zero. You did it, Zero said, taking it from him. We did it, said Stanley. He gathered his remaining strength and tried to pull himself up out of the hole. Suddenly, a bright light was shining in his face. Thank you, said the warden. You boys have been a big help. Chapter 45. The beam of flashlight was directed away from Stanley's eyes and onto Zero, who was standing on his knees. The suitcase was on his lap. Mr. Pandinsky was holding the flashlight. Mr. Sir stood next to him with his gun drawn and pointed in the same direction. Mr. Sir was barefoot and bare-chested, wearing only his pajama bottoms. The warden moved toward Zero. She was also in her bedclothes, wearing an extra long t-shirt. Unlike Mr. Sir, however, she had on her boots. Mr. Pandinsky was the only one fully dressed. Perhaps he had been on guard duty. Off in the distance, Stanley could see 2 more flashlights bobbing toward them in the darkness. He felt helpless in the hole. "You boys arrived just in the nick," the warden started to say. She stopped talking and stopped walking. Then she slowly backed away. A lizard had crawled up on top of the suitcase. Its big red eyes glowed in the beam of the flashlight. Its mouth was open, and Stanley could see its white tongue moving in and out between its black teeth. Zero sat as still as a statue. A second lizard crawled up and over the side of the suitcase and stopped less than an inch away from Zero's little finger. Stanley was afraid to look and afraid not to. He wondered if he should try to scramble out of the hole before the lizards turned on him, but he didn't want to cause any commotion. The second lizard crawled across Zero's fingers and halfway up his arm. It occurred to Stanley that the lizards were probably on the suitcase when he handed it to Zero. "There's another one!" gasped Mr. Pandinsky. He shined his flashlight on the box of Frosted Flakes, which lay on its side beside Stanley's hole. A lizard had crawled out of it. The light also illuminated Stanley's hole. He glanced downward and had to force himself to suppress a scream. He was standing in a lizard nest. He felt the scream explode inside him. He could see 6 lizards. There were 3 on the ground, 2 on his left leg, and 1 on his right sneaker. He tried to remain very still. Something was crawling up the back of his neck. 3 other counselors approached the area. Stanley heard one say, "What's going?" and then whispered, "Oh my God." "What do we do?" asked Mr. Pandinsky. "We wait," said the warden. "It won't be very long." "At least we'll have a body to give that woman," said Mr. Pandinsky. "She's got to ask a lot of questions," said Mr. Sir, "and this time she'll have the AG with her." "Let her ask her questions," said the warden, "just so long as I have that suitcase. I don't care what happens. Do you know how long?" Her voice trailed off. Then she stared up again. "When I was little, I'd watch my parents dig holes every weekend and holiday. When I got bigger, I had to dig too, even on Christmas." Stanley felt tiny claws dig into the side of his face as the lizard pulled itself up off his neck and up past his chin. "It won't be long now," the warden said. Stanley could hear his heartbeat. Each beat told him he was still alive, at least for 1 more second. Okay, we're going to stop there today. So we're stopping with chapter 45 and we'll start with chapter 46 next time. And next time we will be finishing our book because we only have this much more to go. And then that's it. We'll find out what happens at the end of the story. Are Stanley and Zero going to live through being covered by these super poisonous lizards? What's going to happen with the suitcase? What's in the suitcase? I have so many questions. I'm dying to know how this book ends. I thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our chapters. Don't forget to go to evpl.org and you can see all of our resources there. If you go to our YouTube page, EVPL Library, and like and subscribe, you'll always know when we add new content. And I thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to finish the next time we see each other, and hopefully I will see you soon.